Hello, I'm Dan, and this is my assignment submission for the polls 264. In this video essay, I'll be discussing the topic on the question, was the conflict in Ukraine preventable, and if so, who is responsible? Before I'll get into discussion of this question, I'll make a statement that this discussion or the conclusions arriving from it are not my personal views or opinions, but impartial conclusions based on my observations with the purpose of fulfilling the assignment's requirements. Now then, let's get started. The Failure of Western Diplomacy by Dan B. Ukraine is a state placed on the borders between Eastern and Western great powers. It is highly polarized with a considerable Russian ethnic population that holds pro-Russian views on the eastern side of the borders and an Ukrainian population that holds pro-Western side views on the western side. Such situation has made Ukraine a friction point for potential conflict after the 2014 Orange Revolution, which has replaced a pro-Russian government with a pro-Western one. This has caused the Russian annexation of Crimea and resulted in conflicts in Donbas with pro-Russian separatists fighting against the new regime. Between 2014 and 2022, attempts to end the fighting have manifested in Minsk agreements. However, such measures have been unsuccessful and failed to prevent a direct war between Russia and Ukraine in February 2022 over its integration into NATO. The war in Ukraine was the first major conflict in Europe after the end of World War II, which resulted in the end of a relatively peaceful era that lasted more than half a century, thus raising the question of whether the war in Ukraine was avoidable and what are its causes. In this video essay, I will argue that leading cause of the conflict was the expansion of NATO and the Western failure of Western diplomacy to account for Russian interests, which resulted in avoidable tragedy. To understand the root causes of Russo-Ukrainian conflict, the recent history of Ukraine needs to be accounted for. Ukraine gained independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991. From it, Ukraine inherited historical Russian territories and its people on the eastern border, including Crimea, which has been residence of the Russian Black Sea Fleet since 1783. It is also important to note that the Russian fleet was still stationed in the peninsula even though it was officially on a foreign state under a 1997 lease agreement. Along with the Russian territories, people, and the foreign fleet, Ukraine has also inherited nuclear weapons. However, due to the centralized command structure of the former USSR, the leverage over those weapons was in Moscow. Thus, it resulted in a situation at which Ukraine had nuclear weapons that it could not use itself, but still had to face geopolitical burdens of a nuclear state. To avoid nuclear proliferation, both the USA and Russia pressured Ukraine to disarm its nuclear arsenal in exchange for safety assurances. Those guarantees were signed in a December 1994 Budapest Memorandum that stated that Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for safety assurances from the USA, Britain, and Russia. It is also worth noting that agreement was made under the pretext of Ukraine's Declaration of Sovereignty of 1990, stating that Ukraine would not join any military blocs and adhere to a position of neutrality. Under those conditions was formed the state of current Ukraine, which incorporates significant amount of Russian population and lands while also taking a position of neutrality as a border state between Russia and the West. However, because of the internal state factors, the position of Ukraine's neutrality was subjected to influence from foreign states, thus resulting in its variable affiliation based on the pull from foreign powers. Ukraine is a state that is ruled by oligarchs and suffers from corruption, which prevents it from any substantial economic development, despite its richness in natural resources. Thus, any democratic representation that displays the interests of its population in the government is implausible, implying that the positions of power are given to representatives of the oligarchs with the interests of their foreign backers. Due to the proximity of Ukraine with Russia and strategically vital location as a gateway from Europe to Moscow, Ukraine has been historically affiliated with Russia as its satellite state since the days of the Russian Empire and thereby has strong ties with Russia. However, after the collapse of the USSR and the weakening of Russia, the situation in Ukraine has changed, thus creating a power vacuum that invited Western influence into the state, which came in the form of the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Maidan coup in 2014. The 2004 Orange Revolution resulted in the establishment of the pro-Western government that was attempting to shift the Ukraine state into the Western Hemisphere by incorporating it into NATO and the EU, as had been stated by the Western powers in the 2008 Bucharest summit, thus creating tensions with the Russian state and discontent in the Russian ethnic eastern portions of Ukraine. In 2010, a Russian-backed representative was reinstated to power, but was later overthrown by the Western-backed protests at the 2014 Maidan coup. From this situation, it can be concluded that because of the loosened control of Ukraine by the weakened Russia, the West has taken advantage of that moment to further its influence in Ukraine in order to contain Russia from the geopolitically advantageous position. However, such actions by the West have failed to account for the Russian security concern that views the presence of NATO in Ukraine as an existential threat, thus making Russia use direct methods to control the Ukrainian regions, such as the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and support of rebel elements in Donbass. Even so, the Russians was the one conducting the escalations of conflict through the use of military force. It wasn't something within their interest to do because of the potential economic and demographical damage this could inflict. Thus, there were attempts to end the fighting through Minsk protocols, which called for a ceasefire and the autonomy of Donbass from the Western established Kiev regime. However, the 2014-2015 Minsk agreements have failed to prevent the 2022 Russian direct invasion of Ukraine, as lasting peace was not the objective of those agreements for the Western side. As has been stated in the 2022 interview with the former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and backed up by the French President at the time, François Hollande, the true objective of the Minsk peace talks was to stall for time in order to arm Ukraine against Russia, which would provide for the West a solid platform to expand NATO into Ukraine despite the Russian resistance. However, the objectives of the West to turn Ukraine into a NATO bulwark on the Russian borders have led to a tragic failure after the Russian invasion in February 2022. From this, it can be inferred that the Western actions of turning Ukraine into a NATO state while ignoring the attempts from the Russian side to end the conflict through diplomatic means and settling on the neutrality of Ukraine have caused a direct military confrontation between Russia and the Western-backed Ukraine. This has resulted in an avoidable tragedy caused by the Western refusal to account for the Russian geopolitical needs in the Ukrainian region, with the end result of the destruction of Ukraine as a functional state. The Russians have been victims of many foreign invasions, with the most recent one being from Nazi Germany during World War II, which resulted in the deaths of 1 out of 10 Russian people. Many of those invasions have originated from Europe and passed through Ukraine. Because of this, Russians view Ukraine as a key region to their security, similarly to how Americans enforce their security through the Monroe Doctrine by ensuring that no foreign entity exists on the Western Hemisphere. The most notable example of this is the Americans' treatment of Cuba's alliance with the Soviets, which resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. A similar situation is present with the Russians regarding Ukrainian NATO membership and its integration into the West, which Russians perceive as another attempt from the West to invade them, thus leaving them with a limited option to deal with this issue, which are through diplomacy or force. When the first Western attempts to take over Ukraine began in 2004, the Russians tried to resist it through political means by reinstating their preferred candidate back into power in 2010. However, after the West forcefully usurped control over Ukraine through the Maidan coup, a number of peaceful options for Russians became more limited, which resulted in the use of force from their side and led to annexation of Crimea and Donbass rebellions. However, the West continued to push its NATO ambitions into Ukraine, despite opposition from Russia and continual escalation of the situation, while also using deceitful tactics in the Minsk peace talks, causing diplomatic options for Russians to be unattainable because of the lack of trust in the Western diplomacy, thus leaving Russia with the only viable option, which was to force Ukrainian government to accept these terms of neutrality through military pressure, which manifested itself in the special military operation in February 2022. The Russian military invaded Ukraine with a force of approximately 150 to 180,000 troops, and simultaneously called for peace talks with Kiev to end the conflict. The size of the Ukrainian military at the time was 200,000 active personnel, which were on the defensive. It is also noteworthy that the Ukrainian troops received advanced training and military equipment before the start of the war during the period of the Minsk agreements, thus resulting in a situation in which Russian invading forces were outnumbered and fought a peer opponent that was on the defensive, therefore resulting in Russian forces failing to completely fulfill its military objectives of pressuring Kiev into accepting Russian diplomatic terms of Ukrainian neutrality outright. However, even though Russian military didn't accomplish its objectives, it was still sufficient at manifesting peace talks between Kiev and Moscow. The peace talks were held in 2022 Istanbul, with the Russian demands of recognition of Crimea as part of Russia and independence of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. In contrast, Ukrainians have shown openness to neutrality, but were proposing to hold the status of Crimea and Donetsk for long-term negotiations. However, the negotiations were then withdrawn by the Ukrainian side due to the involvement of British Prime Minister at the time Boris Johnson, who dissuaded Ukraine from accepting an unfavorable deal, which was confirmed in an interview with Victoria Nuland in September 2024. This resulted in an end to any meaningful peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, which left the resolution of the conflict to be decided on the battlefield, that Ukraine has no chance of winning, even with the Western support, due to the difference in scale between the states. Currently, after 2 years of active warfare, Ukraine has lost a quarter of its population, which is 10 million people, due to immigration and substantial demographic loss of young men who have been sacrificed on the battlefield to stall Russia and prolong the war. Additionally, Ukraine has also suffered significant infrastructural and economic damages, which will prevent it from any substantial development after the end of the war, thus leaving Ukraine as a ruined rump state without any meaningful prospects of recovery, alongside thousands of people dead and millions displaced or impoverished. Russia has taken all the possible measures to avoid the military conflict while maintaining its security needs. However, due to the Western pressure of weaponizing Ukraine against Russia, Ukraine has been destroyed, while Russia has not even been weakened but experienced economic growth during the wartime period. While in contrast, European countries ended up suffering high energy prices due to the embargo on Russian gas. The current tragedy that is experienced in Europe could have been avoided should the West have refrained from expanding its influence into Ukraine, which Russia sees as quintessential state to its safety from European direction. Western diplomacy has failed to account for the Russian resistance to incorporating Ukraine into NATO, while also overestimating the impact of its economic leverage to subdue Russia. This has resulted in a war due to the Western refusal to back down from its aspirations with Ukraine, resulting in our current long-term tragedy. Even though the Ukraine army was winning at the start of the conflict, after 2 years of attrition war, it is now losing territory and manpower due to the unfavorable differences in scales between the conflicting nations. The peace option for Russia is no longer attainable, since objective of the Russians has shifted from neutralizing Ukraine to destroying it and maximizing its gains from it, since they have already made the economic and blood commitments to the war effort, especially considering that the Russians no longer view the West as a negotiable partner due to a number of duplicitous or sabotaged negotiations. Therefore, the Russians are now interested in taking over the Donbas region, with the potential of also taking over Odessa, Kharkiv, and Kiev, which are the regions of polarized Ukraine that are relatively pro-Russian or within the Russians' reach. It is also important to note that Russians are not interested in taking over the pro-Western, highly nationalistic western side of Ukraine, as governing the Ukrainians is not in Russia's interests. However, that situation would still not result in a peaceful resolution, as instead of conquering the remaining Ukraine, the Russians will try to damage it as much as possible, so the West will not be able to use it in any way to harm Russia. The destruction of Ukraine is an outcome of the West weaponizing it against Russia. The Russians have attempted to prevent it through a number of negotiations that have been either insincere or sabotaged by the West, thereby making the West primarily responsible for causing the conflict and escalating it while ignoring the opportunities to save Ukraine and avoid tragedy through diplomacy. This concludes my discussion of the question whether the war in Ukraine was preventable and who was responsible for it. Thanks a lot for your time, and I hope it was informative to you. Bye.